Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, LGBTQ plus Children's Books, a conversation with our authors. I'm Katie Potter, and I will introduce our lovely panelists in a minute. I just wanted to go over a few things before we begin. This webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive a link to view the webinar within a week. So don't worry if you have to leave early or you have things to do. You will all receive an email with the link and then our lovely book list and resource list after. So I wanted to quickly go over our agenda before we dive right in. And we are so happy to be here with these amazing authors and kicking off Pride Month with a fabulous panel. So we'll talk a little bit about ourselves. I'll have the authors speak about their books and then the inspiration behind the books. They'll share their expertise, their areas of expertise with us, and then we'll dive right into schools, libraries, and other settings and different ways to incorporate these books in your work. I'll touch briefly on the teacher's guide activities that you can use alongside these books. We have free teacher's guides for almost all of our books here at Lee and Low, and they're an amazing resource to use with you, for whether you're a librarian, teacher, family member, caregiver, and then we'll go over the general resources and book lists, which you'll receive after this webinar. I am Katie Potter. I am the literacy specialist here at Lee and Low. I'm responsible for writing and developing the guides that we offer here for our books. I work a lot with university professors and nonprofits on how to incorporate diverse literature in their respective programs, syllabi. I am a former educator myself, and I went to Bank Street to get my master's in literacy and childhood education. So that's a little bit about me. If you have any questions, you can always contact me. I am happy to be a resource for you. So take it away, Kyle.
Wait, do I have to read that about myself?
You can share whatever you want.
Oh, okay. Well, my name is Kyle. That should be apparent by now. My first job is being an elementary school librarian. I work at a school in Chelsea, in New York City, with students 2-year-olds all the way up through 5th graders. And then last year, my first picture book, A Storytelling of Ravens, came out, and that one is about collective nouns. And then my second book, When Aiden Became a Brother, came out yesterday. And exciting.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Lesléa.
I want to see, I'll review my life in this little write-up. I'm a full-time writer. I've been a full-time writer for about 30 years. I've written about 70 books. A lot of them are on LGBTQ issues, both for adults and teens and kids. I think my big claim to fame was Heather Has Two Mommies, which was the first picture book that portrayed a family of 2 moms and their child in a positive way. And I was absolutely thrilled that Lee and Low published my book, Sparkle Boy, which we'll be talking about a little later.
Great. Thanks, Lesléa. And Heather Has Two Mommies is celebrating a really important anniversary this year too.
30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know.
Amazing. Okay, Maya.
Hi. Hello. First, I want to say I'm so honored to be here with Lesléa and Kyle. This is very exciting to me. And essentially, I want to say I've been in the children's book industry for 25 years. It's hard to believe. And I feel like calling out my first book really positions me within that. And you can actually get it through Lee and Low, and it's with Gloria Anzaldúa. And it really opened my mind to what children's books could be. And I think my career in children's books was something I didn't intend to do, but I'm all about consciousness expansion and about equity. And I really believe and have found that children's books are literally the most radical thing you can do. So I personally believe everyone should create a children's book. So
wow.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And I can't say how honored and excited I am to be in your presence here today. So thank you for dedicating your time to us. Okay, so we're going to jump right into our book talks. We will really be getting into more detail in these books in a little bit, but I'm just going to give the authors a chance to briefly describe their book. We'll be showing a lot of beautiful spreads from these books. So yeah, we'll start with When Aiden Became a Brother, which
Okay.
yeah.
I feel weird about going first, but it wasn't my decision, so I'm sorry. So should I just describe the plot, or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the pitch that I've been telling to people, but the pitch, the way I've been describing it to people is that it's about a transgender boy who helps his family welcome a new baby. So when we first meet Aiden, he hasn't yet come out as trans to his family. He's like 3 or 4 years old. And then within the first couple pages, he tells his parents that he's trans. He transitions as much as a 6-year-old, 5-6-year-old can do. And then he finds out that his mom is going to have a baby, and he decides that it's his job to make sure that this baby doesn't feel like he did when he was little, like doesn't get misgendered constantly, doesn't have people place all these weird assumptions on it that that the baby doesn't identify with. And then the rest of the book is just Aiden figuring out how, essentially, like, this is kind of the unspoken theme of it, but it's really Aiden healing from his own trauma through trying to prevent that being inflicted on someone else. I don't use the word trauma because that's it's a much happier book than that.
It is.
But really my thoughts in writing it was like, what does it feel like to be, what's it like to be a trans child? And then what kind of responsibility does Aiden then feel to make a better childhood for his new sibling?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Kyle. And so now we will talk about Sparkle Boy.
So Sparkle Boy is about a little boy named Casey who really loves sparkly things like glittery bracelets and nail polish and skirts, just like his big sister Jessie. Jessie, however, is, at least the beginning of the book, is not that enlightened because she thinks these are quote-unquote girl things because she has been indoctrinated by our society. However, Casey's parents and Abuelita are very supportive of him, and that was really important to me, for Casey to be surrounded by adults who could see him for who he is and appreciate and celebrate him. And then, of course, by the end of the book, Jessie does see the light.
Thanks, Lesléa. And Maya.
Yay, call me Chi. So this is a book about a child who would have been assigned girl at birth. And so it's a way of kind of introducing this concept of being pronoun free to kids and providing a connection to nature as a way to source your sense of identity, and really expanding beyond basically current pronouns and saying, like, so often in queer trans communities, this language wasn't made for me, but was actually created to erase me. So I'm going to use it in a way that actually affirms me in the way that I need. And so it's a way to kind of open that up. You know, it's also a nested curriculum. We'll go into that later. I have to say, what's really awesome is I often hide stuff in my books. I said people to be the artist and the author, right? So if you look at this one, you can see there's a Z at the end of one of the hands, and it has the shape of I love you. And Skye is the name of one of my kids. And then there's an S lying down in the grass also for Skye, who actually this book was created for. So that's a way of kind of keeping the kids in there.
So amazing. And it's bilingual too.
Yes.
So we'll be in this webinar, we will be showcasing these 3 titles, all of which you can buy on our website at leeandlow.com. And now we'll transition into really getting to know how you all as authors were inspired to write your book, and the different ways that you came up with the ideas behind the creation and the development of the book. And so we will first, Kyle, sorry we're starting with you first again, but it's because it's new and we're celebrating.
I know. It's not wrong.
But we'll alternate.
Okay. So it's funny, writing this book felt both inevitable and also in some ways unlikely. So for a long time, I've been kind of grumpy about the trans representation, or especially the lack thereof, that I've seen in books for kids, picture books all the way up through young adult. And I always thought, like, I should write one. It makes sense that I would write one. I identify as a writer. I'm a children's librarian, so it's literally my job to read books to kids. I have a vague idea of what works in picture books. And I've also been trans for a really long time. I first came out in around 2004. I started transition in 2007. I've been enmeshed in queer and trans communities for, going on 20 years now. So I also know what I'm talking about when it comes to these identities. Even though, I have a very specific perspective and experience, I'm connected with a much broader community. So in some ways I was like, I feel like one of the many right people to write this book based on the intersections of all my different identities, experiences, and areas of expertise. But I also didn't want to, because I just couldn't figure out how to do it in a way that didn't feel reductive, in a way that didn't feel overly simplified, and in a way that I didn't want to center like cis people's ignorance, I guess. But I couldn't figure out how to write an accessible picture book for a broad audience that centered the experience or the story that I thought might be most just like interesting and effective. I also didn't want to write a boring book. Like, I wanted to write something that felt like a real story that anyone might want to read to their kid, not just a book to read as a didactic or educational or pedagogical experience. So I was kind of grumpily thinking like, oh, I should write one, but I don't want to, but I should, but I really don't want to. And I was homesick from work one day, and I remember I was literally grating a potato, like making breakfast for myself. And I had this sudden image in my head of a little trans boy saying, this is what my room looked like when I was born, and this is what my room looks like now. And having this kid tell us about himself through the assumptions people put on him when he was born, and then what he chose to do with his life after he figured out that he was trans. And so that little germ of an idea, after many iterations and many drafts and many conversations, turned into Aiden, which honestly, Aiden is a story that I still can't believe that I wrote, because it's just so sweet and so tender and so full of like love and joy and hope. And I tend to be a fairly grumpy person in my day-to-day life. So I think a lot of friends who've known me for a long time who read this book are as surprised as I am that this book came out of my imagination. But I think that also comes from working with children day in and day out for many years now. And I just love them all so much. And while I might be kind of a grump in my real life, I deeply love my students and I want the world for them. And I think that that's what's coming through in this book. Does that answer that question?
Yes.
Okay, good.
And then this this spread showcases Aiden. You can see Aiden in the spread, and it's a wonderful representation of the book. And and you can see the families below, and it's so beautiful. So thank you so much, Kyle.
You're welcome.
And Maya.
Yee. Oh, it's so funny. So what you can't see in this photograph right here is that there's a baby on my back. Our Bubba Skye. And so I feel like in some ways this story always existed. And it was what I really wanted to pass on, having a child. And not that I gave birth to that child, by the way. But that the queer culture and a queer trans-centric perspective that was really rooted in nature, that stepped outside of Western culture, was literally like my goal to pass on. And so this book rose almost as a song to Skye, as a way to say this is what's possible. So I can't remember if I said this before, this child would have been assigned female at birth, and yet their experience is in this really different framework. And embedded in the imagery is really sort of that nonverbal negotiation and that pressure and those assumptions that get laid on children literally prior to birth, and how we can sort of reframe them within this non-Western thing. So you notice, like, I begin within the deep dark earth, and their dream that they end up exploring and coming into right relationship with is almost like this pink question mark, right? And so it's them really coming to terms with how it affects how we think, and how that then affects how we perform in the world, and how we come to know ourselves in relationship to that. So all of that, and there's the picture, I think, on my website has actually Skye in my arms as I'm making the art for this. And
wow.
so it literally was that deep. And that's why it's so nice hearing your voice also, Kyle, because I think having queer trans experience really intimately expressed, and the kind of values we have and what we really want to pass on is part of our like service and part of our culture. Like, we have this really rich, amazing history and perspectives that we can pass on. And I think a lot of times we don't even know the depth and the beauty of what we're passing on because we're so devalued in this culture. And so it's so amazing to see these come out and then have them literally framed within a queer trans perspective. They just become even more rich, because this book often isn't framed within that which I'll go into later, right? How we bring out our assumptions and become aware of them in kind ways, so that we can create transformation in really fundamental ways for our children.
Yeah.
So this was a very important book, I will say, and contributes deeply to my other gender work. So this is really founded with Lee and Mo that I greatly appreciate.
Yeah, really. Yeah, we'll get into Maya's curriculum and all in the training centered around this text. And really quickly about Call Me Tree, it's very accessible because for kids of all different reading levels, and it's so visual, and yet the text, it's not dense text. So that's another reason why I truly cherish that book too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Lesléa.
So I had two experiences that led me to write Sparkle Boy. The first was I was in Provincetown, Massachusetts during Family Week, which happens every summer, and it's just a gathering of queer families to just be together and feel like we can be ourselves. So I was there to talk about my book, Donovan's Big Day, which is about a little boy whose two moms get married. And I was just reading that book, and then I finished reading it, and some kids dashed by, and there were a couple of boys wearing tutus, and they were so happy and full of joy and wearing these tutus and spinning around. And one of the kids had two dads, and one of the dads just sighed so deeply and said, "I wish my son could be himself every day of the year, not just for a week when we're in Provincetown." And that really broke my heart and really stayed with me. And then a little while after that, I visited a friend in San Francisco. So I'm on 3,000 miles away having these two experiences. And this is someone I've known for many, many, many years. And I was staying with him at his house, and I came out of my bedroom for breakfast. And he was dressed in this fantastic yellow nightgown with a matching peignoir. If you don't know what a peignoir is, look it up. And earrings. And he just looked so beautiful. And I had known him for 20 years, and he never dressed like that in front of me before. And I thought, he finally feels safe enough to show this part of himself to me. And I felt so honored that he did that. And so what I do as a writer is I dump my experiences into the salad spinner of my mind, and I pull the string, and then lucky, some text happens. And it took me a really long time to write Sparkle Boy because I couldn't, Casey has this central question, because people say to him, his sister mostly, but some other kids too, you can't wear a skirt, skirts are for girls, you can't wear bracelets, you can't paint your nails. And Casey just keeps saying why. He's about 2 years old, and his dialogue in the book is very simple. He just keeps asking why? And nobody really has an answer. So finally another boy says to him, because that's how it is. And so then his sister says, not anymore, and she comes to her brother's defense. But, when I kept thinking about it, there really is no reason why, for example, a skirt is a piece of clothing that's assigned to females. I mean, it's just a piece of cloth. Anybody should be able to wear it. So, once I realized that there really was no answer to these questions, then something broke open and I was able to write the book.
Great. Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing those amazing experiences. And we're going to then transition into getting into more detail that focus, about your inspiration, but with a more specific question. And I'm going to ask now each author a question that's tailored towards their expertise in their current careers and in their writing. So with that in mind, Lesléa, after you spoke about the inspiration behind Sparkle Boy, and with this month being such a critical milestone for many reasons, how has the reaction to LGBTQ plus content in your books changed or not changed over the course of your career?
Well, I could really speak about this for hours, but I will restrain myself. So Heather Has Two Mommies, here's my visual, right? I have it right here. Came out 30 years ago. So we're talking 1989. So some people were thrilled with the book. Some people were horrified. And I was called all kinds of things like spawn of the devil, a pervert. I mean, this was so out of control and crazy. The book was read on the Senate floor. It's part of the congressional record. People blew up the covers into big placards and they were carrying them around saying this is, the decline of Western civilization as we know it. That doesn't really happen so much anymore. But I have to say, just last week, I was in New York. I was invited to come speak at a school, not even about Sparkle Boy or Heather Has Two Mommies, but about my newest book, Gittle's Journey in Ellis Island's Story, which is about a young Jewish girl who immigrates to this country. It was a Jewish school. Somehow at the last minute, they figured out that I was Lesléa the lesbian, and they uninvited me. So,
Wow.
even though I had promised, and I don't usually promise to be closeted, that I wouldn't talk about Heather because it wasn't really relevant to what I was, being asked to do. So, things have changed in many ways. And in some places of the world, things haven't changed. I mean, there's still many, many places where it's very unsafe for gay, queer, and trans people to live their lives openly and authentically. So I think even though we've done a lot of work, we have a lot of work to do. And when I published Heather Has Two Mommies 30 years ago, there really were no books at all. And so I'm so delighted that there are more books like the two wonderful books by my fellow panelists, because we just can't have enough. And kids just need to be taught from the earliest age that our world is full of beauty and diversity, and everybody deserves to be their authentic selves.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lesléa. And, to that point, Maya, can you talk a little bit about what you were, what you had mentioned before about the pronouns in the book, but, what does it mean for a book to be gender-free? And how is this important to children's literature? Why would this be valuable?
So it's interesting. I really use in my teaching, I really use pronouns as this point of power. We can really make fundamental change by adjusting something as simple as pronouns, especially with very young children. So we don't always have to go into the very large, theory, and I'll go into it later because I'm super nerd and I have tons of theory around this stuff. But with this book, I feel like it was really creating this open space for kids to be themselves, for kids to relax into themselves, and to really pay attention to that moment of assumption, right? Where we project immediately onto children and then have all these expectations that go with it, like I was saying before. So when we remove pronouns and we provide something that is completely different than what we perceive to be standard pronouns, something outside of, he, she, even they, even Z, moving into something, that anyone can claim to themselves, we start opening up this idea of it being gender free. And what's interesting in it is this book is often called gender neutral, which it's not. All of these children are expressing gender, right? They're all sharing that essence of who they are. So there's nothing neutral about this book at all. What we're witnessing is true freedom, right? And not making assumptions. What I often say to folks with this spread in particular is when we find out that the main character would have been assigned female or projected onto as girl at birth, how do we then see them, and how does that reflect on the other kids? So if we imagine for a moment all of these children were also assigned female at birth, what does our perception change? You know, how does that shift in our mind, and does it? Well, what if we imagine they're all assigned male or boy at birth, right? How does that shift, and how are those connected? And then we have to come to the point of, why do we need to know, right? And how can we create spaces that are truly free for children to grow into whoever they are and have that space available? And that this is really a shift, as again, as we go further into my curriculum, it's moving away from definitions and focusing more on the dance, right? On the spirit, on that power of nature and creativity and humanity to move through our bodies to create who we are in the world, and how perfect and awesome that is, right? So it's really about creating a very big space for kids. So it is gender full, and it is gender free.
Gender free. Thank you, Maya. And yes, because gender neutral is, you know, I had been using that term.
I'm like, what is that?
Yeah, exactly. So thank you. Thank you, Maya. And then, you know, gender with a term like gender neutral and different, like, you know, misconceptions about things, you know, pertaining to gender. You know, Kyle's question is, you know, geared towards those types of pitfalls. You know, what common pitfalls or stereotypes, Kyle, do you see in books featuring transgender characters?
Well, first, Maya, I just really liked what you had to say about gender free. I thought that was really lovely. I like that so much better than gender neutral.
Yeah.
Neutral sounds like beige, but gender free sounds like
right, and we are not beige.
No. So common pitfalls and stereotypes. So the things that I tend to not like in trans books for kids are things that I intentionally avoided in Aiden. One of that is I really hate focusing on the bodies of trans children. I mean, number one, it's just kind of gross. Like, I don't think about the bodies of my children unless I'm trying to keep them safe from falling down the stairs. But there's this strange fixation on the bodies of trans children and trans people that cis people often have. And by bodies, you know,
Oh. Kyle, come back.
Amazing.
Oh dear.
I think his computer, luckily he's in the office and he is right here. So
Yay.
Hi, Kyle.
should I?
Can you hear us? No, we're good.
Hi, can people hear me still? Can
Yes.
you guys hear me?
Yes.
We're good.
Okay, good. I'm so sorry. I thought my laptop had more battery and it completely died.
And he's back.
Okay, so I wanted to avoid talking about the bodies of these children because that is creepy and gross and a violation of everyone's privacy. So you'll notice that at no point do I say that Aiden was born a girl or had a girl's body or anything like that. When he was born, people thought he was a girl, and that's not his fault. And that has nothing to do with him. Another thing that I don't like in queer trans books for kids is when they portray these children as being the only one. So these trans kids might have some allies, they might have family or friends who get them and appreciate them, but they don't have trans friends. And, you know, I know that I'm an adult and I'm very lucky to be an adult in New York City. But I found that no matter where we are, we try to find each other. Whether it's online, whether it's at a support group, whether it's just kind of looking around and seeing who feels kind of like you in some way or another. I wanted to make sure that Aiden had trans community and trans friends. And that's why I included the line where it said they learned a lot from other families with transgender kids like him, because he's not the only one, and he can make friends with other trans kids, and he doesn't have to rely on just the the kindness of cis people. Like he can find his own community. And then a lot of those kids show up in the last spread that we're looking at here. I'm kind of imagining that all of these children are trans. Some of them might be, other of his friends, but there's definitely some trans kids in this spread because they're all friends and he deserves other trans friends. And then, so body, community, and then, the last thing that I really wanted to avoid was making his gender, because he is a trans boy, still very like simple and cookie cutter. Like I didn't want to create a super masked little boy who was like, girl stuff is gross. I like trucks and sports. That's not me. That's not a lot of my friends. That is some trans boys, which is fine. But I'm a man and I also hate sports and I like to dress well. And like, I'm also gay. Like I don't feel invested in like hegemonic standards of masculinity. So I wanted to create a little boy who was trans, who was invested in his boyhood, but didn't feel like he had to fall into stereotypical or oppressive or misogynistic ideas of what it meant to be a boy, which is why I'm so glad that he's shown wearing pink and he's wearing one of his old dresses in another scene and is wearing his pink bunny slippers in another scene. Like he's a boy, but like Casey, he could be Casey, he could be a boy who likes to wear dresses or a boy who likes to accessorize. Being trans doesn't mean that we have to be like stereotypically whatever our gender is. We have as much freedom to explore and play with our gender as anyone else does. And I was really excited to show that with Aiden.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks for letting me run over here.
I'm going to pivot to my face. So we'll be going back and forth. And now we'll talk about some tools and resources that you can use to help make a case for including these books. These questions come up a lot. What are the what can I share with my fellow educators or families about incorporating these books in my setting? So Maya, I would love for you to talk about the multitude of resources and curriculum that you offer, because it's incredible, and I encourage you all to really look it up and go to all of these different sites. So take it away, Maya.
Yay, thank you so much for providing a platform to share this with people. This is literally my life, and as a parent and an educator right now, this is really key. And what's happening is that we're creating materials as we go. So we have a 5-year-old that's going to turn 6. And so at about 4 years old, we were like, oh no, we need materials now, because the policing on the playground became so aggressive. And so, well, at times verging on violent, that we had to interrupt that. And we had raised Skye in a very gender-free way, right? And we started realizing that we needed to start landing things so that they were more languaged themselves. So in 2009, a million years ago, I started my own press. And in 2010, I published my first gender curriculum, which was called Gender Now, where I first introduced the gender wheel. And this was in response to a child I was co-parenting at that time who was around the same age. So what happened when Skye turned 4 is we pulled those out and we started using them really actively. And this they, she, he, me, free to be is this way of really looking at gender to open it up and dismantle a lot of the rigidity that happens. So it's not just about expanding what pronouns we use, but really looking at what pronouns can look like, right? So here's she, and yet that presentation, right, is really different across the board. Mm-hmm. So it's a way of like dismantling the rigidity around it and opening up those conversations and languaging kids in ways that make their ability to talk to other kids inclusive. Because what we found is that pronouns are actually taught in a standardized American way that have embedded judgment and stereotypes, assumptions as part of it. So we wanted to really insert our material specifically into those moments so that we could keep that conversation free. Mm-hmm. So this is really about looking at that language acquisition, right? And how we have, because of the patriarchy, because of gender systems of oppression, it is embedded within our language and how we teach it. So how do we like literally change that moment? The gender wheel is the holistic framework of looking at gender from outside of a Western framework, so that instead of going toward the binary, boy, girl, we move into then this next step has been the spectrum, right? But it's still, so it's opened it up the space between boy and girl, and yet it's still centering those as the end point, right? So when we start looking at a gender wheel and we start seeing all bodies in community, we see that each body, each gender, each connection, each spirit, each embedded in nature flows into the next, right? So it takes that isolation off of the child also, and by focusing on the context of our culture, it puts the onus on the system, right? Because a patriarchal system, the highest threat, right, would be a trans woman of color, right? And these, it's no surprise that these are the community members that are most at risk, right? So when we start looking at the system and start saying, oh, so what's been suppressed around nature, what's been suppressed around history and indigenous cultures specifically supports the binary, right? And we start opening up that conversation, well, what does nature actually say? And what we find with educators, I always include Joan Roughgarden whenever I'm talking about gender and nature, is that queer trans experience within the human species is so prevalent as to be necessary, that it's so valuable. It's a part of how we survive and stay strong as a species, and this is true across the board in nature. So bringing that into the conversation really changes how we talk about gender, right? When we start talking about tree as a pronoun, when we start opening up to 3, 4, 5 different pronouns, how we start talking about being inclusive on the playground and not having to know people's bodies, right? So it's a very large conversation, but I'm creating really simple materials to talk to kids about it, right? So we can interrupt that beginning point and keep kids free.
Right.
I could talk for so long. I'm trying to keep it short.
No, you encompassed everything. And starting with Call Me Tree is the first step.
Yes,
and getting kids involved in that conversation at the earliest age possible.
Yes.
Thanks, Maya. So this lovely spread is from Aiden, when Aiden became a brother. And so I'll have Kyle touch a little bit on tools and resources.
Wait, what do you mean again by tools and resources?
It's if you have any suggestions for things that people can look for.
Yeah. So even though the book just came out yesterday, I've already had the opportunity to do 2 school visits with it. And I also last weekend brought it to Gender Conference NYC, which was a conference planned by parents for trans and non-binary kids from, I think, kindergarten all the way up through high school. So when I've read the book in school visits to audiences of mostly, I'm assuming, cis children with a few trans classmates here and there, and also kids who might not know themselves yet, I've come up with some guiding questions throughout the text to help kids who might not have thought about this before think through why Aiden is responding the way he's responding. So on the page where it says, Aiden thought that being a big brother was an important job for a boy like him, I go back and I say, why do you think he feels that way? Why do you think it's an important job, especially for a kid like Aiden? And what's cute is that some kids who are not trans-identified at this point, but have little siblings, will say, well, it's a big deal to be a big sibling because you have to take care of your baby brother or whatever. Yeah. So they're coming at it from their perspective. And then other kids are saying, well, he remembers what it felt like and it didn't feel good, so he wants to make sure this baby doesn't feel bad like he did. And then I have 2 more guiding questions about being misgendered. One is, why does Aiden not like it when people ask if he was a boy or a girl? Which is also me telling kids, hey, don't ask people if they're a boy or a girl. That's not a very kind question. And then the other question that I ask for those audiences is, there's a spread where an older cis white man is like confused by Aiden's gender presentation, and Aiden says, or the text says, Aiden could tell he wanted to ask a different question. And I intentionally don't say what that question is because I want kids to think about that for themselves and come up with possibly even answers that I don't have. But last weekend, when I brought it to all trans children and their siblings, I realized I had to come up with entirely different questions because these kids already know the answers. It's already obvious. It's their lived experience already. And that was, so like, for example, on this page that we're looking at, where it says Aiden loved getting to choose his own, and that he wanted to find a name that could fit this new person no matter who they grow up to be. I asked these kids, even if Aiden chooses the name that doesn't have a gender stereotype attached to it, do you think the baby might still want to change their name someday? And because I was saying, I know some trans people who never changed their names. I know some trans people who maybe didn't have to, but wanted to anyway. And I had a bunch of kids raise their hands saying like, yeah, like maybe the baby just wants people to see them a different way, and changing your name is a good way of getting that to happen. Or, yeah. And then another guiding question that I had was actually asking the kids. So the same question of why did Aiden feel like being a big brother was an important job for a boy like him? But then asking these kids, how do you feel about that? Like if you're trans and you have a little sibling, do you feel similarly to him? Why did you feel that way? And then also the cis siblings shared some really interesting thoughts. Like one kid, I was actually very proud of him. He said, when my little sister was born, it was hard because she got all the attention because she was a baby. And then when she came out as trans, she got all the attention again. And that was kind of hard. And I was like, yeah, that does sound really hard. And it sounds like you're doing a really good job of like being a good big brother, even though it can be hard sometimes.
Yeah.
And I also saw him like change his language. Like he started to say, my sister was a boy. Everyone thought my sister was a boy. And I was like, yeah, you got it. Good job.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Thanks, Kyle. And then we have Lesléa. So I shared this screenshot if you want to talk a little bit about this, Lesléa.
So before I talk about Drag Queen Story Hour, I've just been listening to the wisdom of Maya and Kyle, and it's made me think that one question I often pose to kids and to adults when I'm speaking to groups is, if you had nothing to conform to and nothing to rebel against, who would you be? And I think that's a really interesting question, especially to give to kids, because so in other words, if there were no expectations at all and you were just free to be yourself, what would that look like? Because I feel like stereotyping people and having people only be on the binary hurts everybody, because you could be anybody in the world and want to wear a skirt or want to play with a truck, or they're very simplistic, but just want to express yourself in any way. And if anyone is oppressed, really we're all oppressed. So I just wanted to throw that question out there. If there was nothing to rebel against and nothing to conform to, who would you be? It's a question I ask myself actually constantly. So Drag Queen Story Hour, I'm very happy that Sparkle Boy has been used all over the country. And we had a Drag Queen Story Hour here in Northampton, and it was like the most successful event a library had had. There were like over 100 families that came, and we had so much fun. So we had a fabulous drag queen named Janaya, and she read the book, and then we had sparkle face paint. We made sparkly crowns. We had a dress-up corner and a photo booth, and everyone was just very joyfully playing with trying on different identities. And it was fantastic. And it was so much fun, actually, that somebody who works at the Jewish day school here in town was out of town, and she was so upset that she was out of town that she brought it to the synagogue. And I thought, okay, that is interesting. And it, again, was so successful. It was so well attended, and it actually made coverage in the Jerusalem Post. So I'm very pleased that we had the first drag queen Havdalah. Havdalah is the beautiful ceremony that's performed at the end of every Sabbath in the world. And it was great.
Wow. Awesome. Thanks. Thank you, Lesléa. And then we've talked a little bit about this throughout the webinar, but I wanted to get into more specifics if our authors want to share some anecdotes about what they've experienced working with kids in their books. How have kids, and Kyle really talked about this in the last slide, but if you feel like sharing any specific moments Well, we'll also talk a little bit about how you can engage with our authors in terms of visits and different trainings. So Lesléa, you know, to piggyback off of Drag Queen Story Hour, here, you know, this is a shot of your author page if you want to talk a little bit about your author visits and things like that.
So, you know, when I go to schools and I read Sparkle Boy, there are some natural pauses in the text that I just wanted to mention, because when Jessie says, you know, boys can't wear skirts, right, Mama? There's this pause where it says, Mama thought for a minute. And that's a really good invitation to the kids who are listening to the story to say, well, what do you think? And what do you think Mama's thinking? And those pauses are just built in all through the books. And so I love, you know, when I'm reading to kids and they participate with kind of a back and forth, a call and response, and they really get into the book. And by the end of the book, when it says Casey and Jessie love all things sparkly, especially each other, kids burst into wild applause, which of course I love. And I just wanted to, I have a little show and tell. So this was sent to me. It's a little card. Can you see the sparkles on it?
Mm-hmm.
And on the back, there's a little note that says, it's upside down, my favorite part of Sparkle Boy is everything. And so I treasure this. I keep this right by my desk. So, you know, I go to schools, I go to conferences, and I talk to adults. I have this presentation called Dump Trucks and Dresses and Dolls, Oh My, Smashing Gender Stereotypes in Children's Literature, where I go back and I start with the story of Ferdinand, the bull, and go through William's doll and Princess Smarty Pants, and just show teachers and librarians and parents different books that you can use that might introduce different ways of looking at the world to your kids. Because even now, there are so many books, of course not published by Lee and Low, that really reinforce these gender stereotypes that we are working so hard to smash.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lesléa. So Maya, if you want to give a little bit of, give some detail about your trainings that you offer.
Blah, blah, blah. Oh my goodness. So it begins with really so much. I don't go into the classroom anymore. I did that for many years, but because we're really focused on developing materials and getting educators trained, I mostly work with grown-ups now. But what we're doing is we're really trying to, because our work is grounded with our own child, how to create materials that really convey the curriculum for us. For one. So one of them is, and again, these are all connected to Call Me Tree, which is what's so trippy. So we have an ABC book now that basically provides the opportunity to practice inclusive pronouns and way to engage with kids. And we're also have cards. We just actually launched a campaign today. And what's funny is that Matthew, my partner, pulled out all the cards that have tree as the pronoun on the back. And so this is a way where we're trying to open up that conversation with kids and educators about how we talk, but also really attending to kids personally. Because of my connection for decades now with the trans community and it being a part of my intimate life and really wanting to convey that part of our culture, that's really like looking for those materials where I can use children's books and these kind of materials for attending to the littles, really. So tree, I guess the most important thing I can say is that I now know a number of kids who go by tree, that they could not find themselves in our language. And when they came across tree, they were like, that's me. I finally feel like I can rest down. And so in a way that kind of confirms all of my other curriculum that I buzz around trying to implement. Mm-hmm. It's really like, I want kids to feel like they belong and that this is their home and that there's a way that they can convey who they are and to start really dismantling the larger systems that pretend that we have never been to, right? Mm-hmm. And that gender is something different than spirit passing through our bodies and enlivening us and connecting us to one another. Mm. So what I often say to people is there are these small things that I provide in my trainings. I have a gender reorientation introduction workshop that I do that has hands-on materials where you get to work with the cards, you get to actually work with the gender wheel, practice reading books so that you can start really exploring on a more somatic physical, playful level, what it means to become gender inclusive, looking at how you think. And now we've developed the second in the series, which is about language acquisition and how do we create inclusive practices from the beginning. So that's really going to go into the gender wheel. The center circle is the pronoun circle. And so how do we really use pronouns as that point of power, right, to create real inclusion and to transform how we see each other, right, to come to a more equitable place, a more round place. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Maya. And then this is a snapshot of Kyle's website.
Which is just kylelukoff.com. It's very easy.
/contact.
/contact, sure.
Great. And then this is our last question, and I know we have 10 minutes left. So I want to make sure, you know, we may have time for only a few questions, but we'll get. You know, I want to really emphasize this one in particular. You know, what advice do you have for bringing this to your school? You know, what kind of, this kind of encapsulates our last question too. You know, what advice do you have for bringing this to your school? And then what do you do when you get pushback from families or from educators, librarians, administrators?
So I have two points of advice, both of which are from a librarian perspective, and that's my primary profession. One, I would hope that your library has an acquisitions policy and a policy around challenges. So first, I like making it as hard as possible for people to officially challenge a title. So like my library has a challenge form. It's really hard to find, but if you don't want a book in my library, I tell you to fill out the challenge form, and I'm not going to tell you how to find it. And then also, hopefully, the library has a policy around reviewing titles that are challenged that is operating in your favor. I recommend, if you don't have one, writing one. If you don't like it, see who you can talk to rewrite it. And then another framework that I found incredibly helpful, especially my first few years on the job, was something that I saw in a comment on a school library journal article. I know I cannot find it anymore, so I cannot give proper intellectual credit to this person, and I'm very sorry. It's not my idea. Someone else said it first. But there is this argument that if you have books that portray, for example, gay marriage or trans identities in a positive way, isn't a library then required to also have materials showing these identities or experiences in a negative way to provide like balance or both sides or some of those terrible ideas? And I was like, oh man, do I have to get books that say gay marriage is bad? I don't want to do that. And then someone commented saying, no, balance for saying that, like, so a book like Aiden saying that being trans is perfectly fine is not balanced by materials that say that being trans is bad. The books that say being trans is fine are balanced by all the materials in my collection that say that being cis is also fine. So if I were to get books that were saying that gay marriage is somehow bad, I would also have to get books that say that straight marriage is somehow bad. That would be how balance would be provided, not by showing both sides of one experience, but showing it's math. I don't know. If we say that cis kids are good, we should also say that trans kids are good. If we say that trans kids are bad, we should also say that cis kids are bad. I'm not going to do that. And I love that as a framework and as a way of arguing, like, no, I do not have to provide materials to balance out this perspective because it is already well balanced by the wealth of materials that show being cis in a positive or normal light. And this is just trying to shift that balance like a minuscule amount. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense to the two of you?
Definitely. And I hope that's really helpful for our audience and in terms of framing their thinking about creating whether it's a classroom library, school library, a collection in their home. So thank you, Kyle. Kyle spoke a little bit about this, but I encourage you all to research. This is a gender conference here in NYC. It already passed, but looking for events in your community, I think, is essential in doing this work. So Maya, if you want, we've talked about this, but I wanted to show everyone again, Maya, the gender wheel and playing with pronouns. Maya, if you want to talk a little bit more about playing with pronouns.
Well, it's interesting. I wanted to speak to this pushback moment because I hear this a lot. And I think what's interesting I get brought into schools a lot and work with a lot of early childhood educators, excuse me, and what I provide, people are like, well, what about the parents? I was like, okay, we got the parents, we got to attend, there's going to be freak out. I've been around the freak out. And what I'm finding is that what I teach is basically that inarguable piece. So what I teach is a social justice frame because I center Indigenous and people of color first, and I do that through a queer, trans, non-binary lens, right? So this is already an established systemic perspective to look so that when we start looking at what's been suppressed by the dominant culture with great intention, right, we notice that nature has been distorted, that history has been erased, and that Indigenous cultures have been colonized and reformed in ways that erases the truth of their original context, right? So what I do is I basically say I'm bringing back and integrating, synthesizing into our current awareness how this has impacted our community and how this has impacted how we think as a people, as a culture, and what kind of damage it's been done. So by centering queer, trans, IPOC people, we begin to shift sort of that systemic damage that has been done and pursue a social justice frame toward equity. So it means looking at everything, right? It's not about the small things. It's about opening our minds to the larger conversation about how Western culture has impacted queer, trans, non-binary people and to what intention, right? And so with that in your back pocket, people can feel more confident, more informed. They know where to look. They know where to go. And in terms of nature, which is always what I keep in my back pocket the most, what we're seeing is that because it's been nature studies have been suppressed and distorted, what we're starting to reclaim is that queer, trans, non-binary experience and presence is so valuable as to keep us strong, right? So holding that as this is the truth of nature and this is why it's been suppressed, how do we now reevaluate? I find that's the most solid response I found to pushback. Like, okay, let's look at the reality of the larger context.
Thank you, Maya. And Lesléa, you had alluded to this earlier. This is more about your training, but can you also speak to pushback that you get, and what advice would you give to our audience in incorporating books in their setting?
Well, I think the most important thing that one can do is to really do some serious internal work. All of us, if we were raised in this country, we were raised in a misogynist, homophobic, racist, classist, ageist society. And so we have to undo a lot of those messages. So I think to do your own work and really be honest and push yourself is vital so that you don't go into a classroom as a hypocrite, really. Because kids know immediately, if you're uncomfortable. So I think it's really important for each of us to do our own work. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to know where your administrators stand on these issues, because you don't want to be blindsided by your principal or your boss really coming down hard on you because you brought a certain book into a classroom and a parent got hysterical, which happens, and your principal or administration doesn't have your back. That's really important. So you might want to kind of suss that out first. And then also be aware of many resources such as the American Library Association Office of Intellectual Freedom, the National Coalition Against Censorship, PFLAG, GLSEN, which is Gay, Lesbian, Straight Educational Network. So, be prepared and know how important it is, because really what you are doing is saving children's lives. So, I can't stress that enough. So, and this is our job, not only as teachers or librarians, but as human beings. We have to protect children. We have to give children the tools that they need. So we have to do whatever it takes to prepare ourselves to do that.
Thank you, Lesléa. Wow. I wanted to talk a little bit about some resources that we offer here at Lee and Low. I had talked earlier about how we have teacher's guides for these titles that we showcased here in this webinar. They're on our website. I have shown some arrows on how to get access to those documents, and they pose questions, different activities, all sorts of links to background information. So please check these out. Same for Call Me Tree. Maya has amazing resources around this book, but we also created an educator guide for it as well. And Aiden, lastly, when Aidan became a brother, this guide is newly launched on our website. So please feel free they're all free and downloadable. So I wanted to pick a few questions from these books really quickly before we have to wrap up. Really digging into Aiden's character, what and how can Aiden teach us? And then, I wanted to add on to that, how did we change as a part of reading this book? Having your young readers think about those questions. This is an activity from the Call Me Tree guide, having students brainstorming about Call Me Tree because, and then that gives them freedom of expression into thinking about how they can express themselves. And Lesléa, I quoted you here in this activity, the rules, writing Sparkle Boy to challenge the rules that our society dictates that are harmful to us all, including the notions about gender. And getting young students involved in this type of work is critical. They're in this journey with us. So anything that you can do to involve your young readers and students in your library, classroom, home. We have, I said this at the beginning of the webinar, we have a book list and resources. The book list are all books here at Lee and Low, but we have a few lists on the next page for additional resources on advocacy and activism in your community. So please check that out. We also have a collection on our website, so feel free to look at that. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So if you have a question, please feel free to direct it at us. This webinar was basically guiding questions and things that we wanted to know from our authors. But if anything comes up in the meantime, please let us know. Again, we're going to conclude with some Lee and Low Books social media accounts. Please follow us. We also have a great blog that we update frequently, so check it out for more articles and things that pertain to your own work. These are Kyle's channels, so please follow him at any of these sites. Lesléa on Twitter and her website, Lesléa Kids, and then Maya. And then these are all the different ways that you can find Maya and her work on trainings and consulting. So please feel free to look up all of these incredible authors. Again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to speak with our audience about these critical issues. You do amazing work, and we really want to thank you, and we are so honored that we get to have these books published by Lee and Low. Again, this webinar is being recorded, and that's all. So thank you, Lesléa. Thank you, Maya.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks, Kyle.
Sorry about my technical difficulties.
Thank you for having us on the webinar. It was great. I learned a lot.
It was a true honor. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Bye.